We are here for 2 hours maximum. We have what we're going to do is split up the time. I've spoken with the author, and he's going to have present the bill along with a witness that'll go ahead and accompany him, and he'll introduce that person, and they'll go ahead and he'll run through the bill, and then answer questions from the committee. And we'll definitely get through at least a round. I understand the author has a presentation that will, just so he knows, I think he does, that'll be part of his hour. So to the extent that we can go ahead and expedite that, that'll allow more time for Q&A from the membership. Then at 3 o'clock, we'll go ahead and have the second panel come up. That'll be the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, the members, individuals in opposition, the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, the DA's Association, the Sheriff's Association, and the Chiefs of Police Association, I understand. They'll do the same thing. They'll make their presentation. We'll go through at least one round. Members of the committee will just go around the table, and then we'll see where we are. I'm not going to interrupt anybody at 3 o'clock or at 4 o'clock, but we'll definitely give folks the sign to go ahead and wind up so we can be really be very fair-minded about the time. So with that, I've taken a minute of the author's time. He'll get that on the back end. So Representative Peake, if you want to come forward with whoever you may want to have accompany you if you want, and if not, that's fine too. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We on?
Yeah, Representative Peake, let me ask, if there are other House members who are here who'd like to come up to and find an open seat, please feel free to. We'll obviously defer to members of the committee when we go to Q&A, but other members who may not be on the committee are more than welcome to come sit down and listen, certainly. Representative Peake, you're on the clock.
All righty. Just making sure everybody's getting good and settled. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I think this is my first time in front of Judy Non-Civil, so glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for the bill. Let me make sure that mic is working properly.
Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. Just need to get a little closer to it.
Let's try that. Go ahead.
Testing 1 2. Go eat at Cheddar's. 1 2 3. Because we have delicious food.
That'll cost you 3 minutes for your presentation. It's up to you.
Okay, we ready?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just want to make sure we're working off the right LC. LC 371892S is the committee substitute that we have here, too.
1892S. LC 371892S.
Yes, sir. That's it. I'd like to, if I can, Mr. Chairman, just walk you through a brief presentation, and we'll just kind of go through it real quick. Members of the committee, it's up there, and you should have a hard copy as well, too. I want to give you just a kind of 101, Medical Cannabis 101. They're close to, last year we had this presentation of this bill in the Health and Human Services, so just to make sure we all kind of understand some of the terminology I'm going to throw at you today. They're close to 100 cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, but the two main ingredients are THC and CBD. THC is the best known. It causes psychoactive or a high effect. That's what folks are familiar with. CBD is also prominent, has therapeutic effect, is non-psychoactive, and can counter the effects of THC. And both CBD and THC are classified as Schedule I drugs. We'll be talking about CBD and THC a bunch today. So there are now 23 states that have full medical marijuana laws in our country, and there are 11 states that have CBD specific laws that either have high in CBD or no THC. So as we talk about the 23 states that have full medical marijuana laws, and then 11 states with CBD specific laws, you'll understand what we're talking about. And as you can see up there's Georgia right in the middle of the southern states that all about lonesome. Let me tell you a little bit about how this story got started. A young girl by the name of Charlotte Figge was having 100, 200 seizures a day, lived out in Colorado. Her mom and dad were basically at their wits' end of what to do for their child, and basically almost given up. And this mom did some research, found out that cannabis oil was having some positive effects for kids in England, and took the drastic step to take a look at giving her child cannabis. And there was a CNN documentary in March of 2013 by Dr. Sanjay Gupta that kind of chronicled their story, told about this young child taking the medical cannabis oil and seeing just amazing results. So after 2 years later, Charlotte, Figgy, the young girl, is doing amazingly well, seen significant reduction in her seizure activity, significant improvement in cognitive ability. And that's how the whole story kind of got started, and why this particular issue has kind of come across, been sweeping across the country. Bringing it a little closer to home, last year I met a little girl named Haley Cox. Her mom, Janaea Cox, called me and said, I wish you'd check into our story. I have a 4-year-old daughter who has 100 to 200 seizures a day. We're looking at moving to Colorado because we've heard about Charlotte's Web. We're going to move, separate from our family, separate from our support network, and go out to Colorado because it's not available here in Georgia. And that's what kind of set me in motion of trying to figure out how in the world we could pass legislation that would allow cannabis oil in Georgia. This is just a real brief picture. You can see that was when she was in ICU when I first met her, actually. And then they moved out in March of 2014, and this is little Haley Cox 4 months after CBD. If you'll give me just a brief liberty, she sent me a note today. I said, tell me how she's doing. And these are her words, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'll read from Janaea Cox, the mom of Haley Cox. Haley is a whole new child. She smiles all the time, has so much to say. She's gone from over 200 seizures to having 12 seizure-free days, 8 of them being in a row. She has more muscle tone, is holding her head up and sitting with some assistance for more than 30 minutes at a time. She's tracking things, become a lot more verbal. She repeats sounds back to me and says mama and night-night. She tells me night-night every time she goes to bed. Without cannabis oil, Haley would have died. Thanks to cannabis oil, she is thriving, and her dad and I can't wait to wake up and see her sweet smile every morning. This was a girl, young little 4-year-old who was in ICU when I met her, actually on her deathbed, and moved to Colorado and has seen amazing results. So there are 2 objectives in HB 1, and we'll go through the bill real quick in a second too. But first one is to provide immunity by decriminalizing possession of cannabis oil with less than 5% THC or 3% for under 18. I'll be more glad to walk through how we got those percentages in a minute. And a minimum of 1-to-1 CBD to THC ratio. Again, if you remember CBD being a therapeutic component of the plant, THC the psychoactive. So we've required in our bill that there's a 1-to-1 minimum ratio so that the therapeutic benefit of CBD will counteract any potential psychoactive effect of THC in the product. And it's for only certain medical conditions upon registration with the Department of Public Health. We're working with the Department of Public Health to set up a protocol where citizens who do have the qualifying conditions could register. They would actually be given a registration card that I'll show you a picture of in a minute as well too. Second objective, while I would have liked to have seen us have an in-state cultivation grow model where we could actually have access inside the state of Georgia this year, it didn't appear that was in the cards to gain support at all levels of our government. And so what we decided to do was to create a commission with specific mandate to make recommendations to the governor by December of 2015 for the best model for an in-state regulatory structure for growing, processing, and distributing cannabis oil in Georgia. And so those are the 2 main objectives. There are 17 medical conditions in HB 1, and these are how many are permitted in the other 23 states with full medical marijuana laws. Here's the picture right there. I know it's a little hard to read, but I think each of you should have that. The 17 conditions, let me just walk through them real quick, are cancer, which is in every single state, is a qualifying condition in all 23 states with full medical marijuana laws. Glaucoma, same thing. AIDS, ALS, which is in 11 states. Seizure disorders, which is in 20. Multiple sclerosis, which is in 10. Crohn's disease, mitochondrial disease, which is meets the chronic pain, which is in 19 states. Alzheimer's disease, muscle spasticity disorder, which is in 20 states. Fibromyalgia, which also meets the diagnosis of chronic pain criteria in 19 states. Terminal illness, Parkinson's disease, PTSD, autism, sickle cell anemia, and Tourette's syndrome. I realize there are a lot of concerns, and you're going to hear some folks talk about it today regarding HB 1. Let me just address those real quick, if I can. There's a concern, and I've heard it. If I've heard it one time, I've heard it 1,000. That this is the beginning of a slippery slope by adding more conditions and a higher level of THC than just seizure disorders and will lead to recreational use of marijuana. Let me just, a couple of points that are very, very clear. Governor Deal was reelected for the next 4 years. He has made it very clear that he will never support any legalization of marijuana for recreational use in our state. I also want to reiterate that that is my stance as well, that I will fight against the legalization of recreational use of marijuana in our state with as much passion as energy as I'm fighting for citizens to have access to cannabis oil in our state. I also want to remind everybody that that decision is up to us. And I doubt very seriously that it would be the will of the General Assembly to move toward a path of legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. Also, the fact that low-limit THC cannabis oil should be accessible to citizens who can benefit, including those with cancer, ALS, MS, Parkinson's disease, all with evidence of positive benefits and consistent with what is law in other states that have medical cannabis legislation. Another concern is that the THC level of 5% is the same as what was used by folks my age in the 60s and 70s, and maybe used by many of you on this committee at some point in your lifetime. We may not ought to ask that question, but let me just address the chemical composition of that very quickly, because you're going to hear that in a minute, that the 5% limit that we're putting on in this bill still causes a psychoactive or high effect, and similar to what was used in the 60s and 70s. Let me just be real clear. This is cannabis oil. It is not smoked, okay? It is not inhaled. It looks like, comes in a product like this. It's oil that's taken either intravenously or orally through a syringe. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was none, if any, CBD product smoked in the product that was smoked. And the cannabis oil in this product is diluted with an olive oil or coconut oil, and it has a minimum of at least, per our law, 1-to-1 CBD to THC ratio. So the CBD is going to counteract, which it does, any psychoactive effect from the THC ratio. And let me just give a couple of experiences. We have a gentleman today by the name of Vince Seifert. I don't know, is Vince here? Hey, Vince, how you doing? Let me just tell you about Vince if I can for just a second. He has a daughter named Miranda, beautiful 20-year-old now, right, Vince? 20-year-old girl who has epilepsy. He and his family made the very courageous decision, as 16 other families that we know of, to move to Colorado so that his daughter could have access to cannabis oil to help with her epilepsy and her seizure disorder. And every single one of these families I've been in contact with and asked personally, what is the amount of THC in the product that you're given to your child? And most of these families have kids that are young, anywhere from 2 years old to 9 or 10 years old. And every single one of them was using a product that was less than 3% THC, and that's why we put the 3% max in the bill. But Vince's daughter, Miranda, who is older, and so obviously larger than most of the young kids, uses a product that is what, 4.8%? Vince, am I telling that right? 4.8%. Vince, does she have any psychoactive effect from a 4.8% THC level? None at all. No high, none at all. And so we use that as the basis of, okay, here's a dad who's given his daughter a 4.8% THC level product. Not seeing any psychoactive effect because it's counteracted. The CBD counteracts the THC in the product. So that's why we went to a 5% THC level. We wanted to make sure, one, we bring every single one of our medical refugees, of which Vince and his family are, home. And so that's where we went to the 5%. There's also a young woman here today. Is Katie Crosby here? I don't know if she suffers from fibromyalgia. And her mom, I know very well. She went to high school with my kids. She's 26 years old. Went out to Colorado to see if they could access cannabis oil that would potentially help her pain that she has because of fibromyalgia. She took a 6% THC product with a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC, so it's 6% CBD also, product, and saw amazing results of relief from pain that was caused by her fibromyalgia. I asked her mom directly, I said, did you see any psychoactive effect? Was there any high associated for your daughter when she took this product? And she said, absolutely not. There was no high effect whatsoever. And so that was the rationale behind when we drafted this bill of coming up with 5% THC level for adults for the certain qualifying conditions and a 3% maximum for children. And that was the rationale for that. You're also going to see that there are no THC limit. In the 23 states that have full medical marijuana laws, there's no THC limit. I mean, there's just no limit at all on the THC. We in our bill have put that 5% max on there in an abundance of caution. How about in the states that have a CBD specific states? There are maximum THC levels in those 11 states that and they range from anywhere from 0.3% to 3%. And again, what we did was take the maximum of that range at 3% and felt like that was the right level to put it at, to make sure that we provided some flexibilities for families who maybe have a 10 or 11-year-old who may be heavier set as well too. You're also going to hear today that it's too hard for law enforcement to enforce. And believe me, I make it very clear to my friends that are here today from the sheriff's office and the police chiefs and the DAs, I have tremendous respect for the job that they do, and I'm grateful for the service they have to our state and keeping our citizens safe. But let me just tell you the steps we've taken to help make sure that we provide, make sure they have what they need to make sure that this is not a trouble spot for them. One, the bottle of oil is going to be labeled just like this. It'll have, and you can't see this, but there's a THC level and a CBD level on the product, so they will be able to know, okay, is the THC level of 5% or 3% for a child? Is it below that maximum on the label for the bottle? The patient will also have to register with the Department of Public Health. You'll have something like this, a medical registry card that would be issued to a patient after they have not a recommendation from a doctor that they use cannabis, but a acknowledgement from a physician that they have a qualified condition. So I as a MS patient would go to my doctor, get a written statement that I have MS. I would then communicate that from the doctor to the Department of Public Health and register with the Department of Health and then receive a medical cannabis registry card. Something along those specs. We're having conversations with the Department of Public Health to make sure that protocol is in place.
As you're speaking, we're going to have the PowerPoint passed out. I don't think it's in members' folders. Is that correct? Or is it?
Yeah, no, we did pass out. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, I had my assistant do it.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Everybody should have it.
Thank you. Sorry for interruption.
Then we're going to make sure there's additional budget resources required for GBI. Okay, let's say a law enforcement officer stops a citizen who's driving. They have the oil. They have the registration card, but maybe for some reason the law enforcement officer thinks that this is more than 5% and they want to test it. So they would send this to the crime lab to be tested for potency, and we're going to help make sure that there are budget resources. I can't imagine that there would be a whole lot of instances where that would be the case, where the law enforcement officer would be in a position where they would think they need to test the oil. I can't imagine that that's the case, the reality. But there is a possibility that that would be, so we want to make sure GBI has the resources to do that. So there's going to be concern that it's going to cause DUIs because people are taking an oil that's so low you can't get high off of it. There are still impairment laws in place. So that if a law enforcement officer stops someone, they have the vial of oil, they have the registration card, but they have a sense that a person is impaired, that does not take away the right for them to potentially arrest that person for being impaired. Okay. I've also heard, you're also going to hear today that there's no scientific evidence, not enough clinical trials proving the medical efficacy of cannabis oil. And again, gosh, if I had $1 for every time I've heard this, I'd build about 100 cheddars instead of a few of them. If you still doubt the medical efficacy of cannabis oil, I wish you would have a conversation with one of the 17 families that have moved to Colorado or California. Because I'm telling you, folks, there is no doubt in my mind that this product works for children with seizure disorders. There is no doubt that it works for other citizens with other conditions. And so, while that may be discussed, and while there's not enough research because it's still a Schedule I drug, and so therefore research is limited, that should not preclude us from moving forward with a bill that would provide citizens the right to make their own personal choice, along with their physician, of what's in the best interest for their health. I've said it many times that we can't move fast enough. Last year was disappointing that we didn't get this bill passed. Because since that time we've had 5 children. One died last week, and I wasn't able to put her in the picture, who died from seizure-related disorders. We've had hundreds of other citizens in our state who have continued in their pain and suffering because of the conditions, the medical conditions that they had no choice about having, that they have. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop at that point and ask for questions. You should have, those are a couple of the resource materials that you should have in your packet, and I'll be more than glad to answer some questions.
Thank you for the presentation. On the list of conditions, it's a sizable list, but it's certainly understood as to why those conditions are listed. There are a few conditions in there. I mean, I think most of us, and we are laymen, will go ahead and make the connection in our minds about it's related to pain, discomfort, quality of life. There are some conditions, without getting into the specifics of them. Would you say that we do better to err on the side of listing conditions where there is, obviously that pain, quality of life relationship? There are some on the list, at least in the substitute that I have on 1892S, where that nexus is not necessarily as clear. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. We went by what is consistent in other states, and with the exception of maybe 3 or 4, they're almost in every state that has some type of medical marijuana legislation. Okay.
Talk to us in general about the THC level. Let's get a little deeper on that level, what that level means. Let's contrast that with House Bill 885 from last year. Different bill, we understand that.
Right.
Different circumstances, we also understand that.
Right.
Walk us through the differences in the THC level then, okay, as now, and then obviously it's an increased level now within this substitute. And by the way, to members of the committee, the substitute that's presented is presented by the author, not by the committee, which is perfectly fine. It's a good place to start, but just don't make sure the membership is aware of that. But walk us through the rationale on the increased level, because that is different than what the membership voted on last March.
That's correct.
Okay.
We looked at a bill last year that was very low in THC. At the end of the last bill that we were voting on, it was 0.8% THC and would have been limited to seizure disorders. Since that time, we've had the Medical Cannabis Study Committee, in which we heard testimony from citizens from all over the state with different diagnoses who have had access to cannabis, maybe in another state or in another situation, and so we tested them of how much THC is proper for what the diagnosis that you might have. We also chatted with medical marijuana experts all over the country of what is the boundary of what is the amount of THC that potentially would cause a psychoactive effect, but also is enough to make sure it has some positive results for therapeutic benefits for citizens of a particular diagnosis. And the consistent number we kept coming back to was this 5%. That the 5% was kind of it's getting close to where a psychoactive impact could be had, but as long as you're counteracted with a minimum of 1-to-1 CBD to THC ratio, that you would be safe from a potential high. And so that's how we got to that 5%, as well as getting boots on the ground, if you will, information from families who have moved to another state and finding out what is the THC level that they have been using for their particular children or for their particular diagnosis.
Will you be having a medical professional speak to that issue?
We may not have a medical professional, but we have an individual who is in the medical marijuana industry who has been providing cannabis to patients for over 10 years, probably, yeah, something like that. And so, and is the manufacturer of Charlotte's Web, the product that we chatted about earlier. So, but I will not have a medical professional, no, discussing that today.
Okay, there was going to be a witness.
Yes, we do have one of the 17 families is an ER doctor by the name of Dr. James Smith, and he's the person who cannot be here. That's correct.
Okay.
He has a daughter who is, and they have moved out to Colorado and are accessing cannabis oil at this point, and he could not. He's going back and forth,
Sure.
and so he couldn't work out the days to be here.
So. Okay. Members of the committee, Mr. Pack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Representative Peake, thank you so much for all your work and effort in addressing this issue. I know you've been working on it, and you've been very passionate about it, and I want you to let you know that it hasn't gone unnoticed,
Thank you.
particularly by members of this committee. Staying on the question about the 5% and 3%, the question that I have is, I know it looks like you're excluding from definition of marijuana persons who have a prescription for a particular type of oil.
That's correct.
But why have the cutoff at like age 18? Because I could foresee a situation where a doctor might say a 17-and-a-half-year-old who's, physically an adult, but you're limited to 3% versus why define it like that versus leaving that to the doctor if 5% is approved? What was the thinking behind that?
Well, the thinking was an abundance of caution, and from the 17 families or 16 families that had kids that were less than 18, they were all below that 3% level. I think the oldest kid we have may be 13 or 14, and was still in the kind of 1 to 1.5%. So we felt like that would give enough flexibility going up to the 3% range for a child up to 18. There's no magic in that number. It was really just more of an abundance of caution. It's the best answer I can give you, really.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peake, thank you again for the work you're doing. I appreciate the importance of what you're doing. And in fact, I've signed the bill as a co-sponsor, but I have some questions for you about it. First is sort of structurally, I noticed that the crux of the bill is redefining the term marijuana in Title 16 instead of simply making amendments to the what I would say the more substantive existing enforcement provisions. Can you tell me why you're doing that?
Yeah, I know. Lynn Witten's here today, legal counsel. She's here. We wanted to make sure we gave the broadest amount of immunity and protection for the families, and so whether it be from an employment standpoint or from DFAC standpoint, and so that was the rationale behind saying, okay, well, let's just make sure we'll take the definition of cannabis oil, less than 5% THC, for a medical condition as approved by the Department of Public Health, and eliminate that from the definition of marijuana. So as long as you're in possession of this, as long as you have your registration card, as long as you have a qualifying condition, and therefore it's not. It's just like carrying any other health product. And so we felt like that gave the broadest protection for our citizens rather than just going into the different code section. And so I'm not a lawyer as smart as you, a lawyer yourself.
I doubt that.
But that was the advice from legislative counsel. So.
Okay. And then the second question, a little different issue. I noticed the chairman sort of gave a general question about some of the items listed in the definition, some of the different conditions that you've listed. And again, I think there is a clear nexus between a lot of these conditions and the need for alleviation of pain in particular. But I'm curious about an explanation for the conditions included in lines 48 and 49. Line 48 is just an abbreviation, PTSD. I assume that's post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's correct, yes.
And then line 49 is autism. Can you explain the rationale for including those two in particular in this list?
PTSD, I think is recognized as a qualifying condition in a handful of states. Not all states have full medical marijuana legislation. So again, the logic of including many of these was, okay, again, if I've got a product that's so low in THC it's not going to make me high, and I've got to meet a qualifying condition, why not allow as much access to those that can benefit, where there has been some evidence of benefit? And let's see, Grant. Yeah, we've got, and I won't bring them out, but we've got evidence and research studies shown where PTSD does, or folks with PTSD do derive some benefit from cannabis. Same thing for autism. That while it's not allowed in any state so far, there is some evidence and some studies being done that there is some potential benefit for children with autism. And so again, the logic being, if it's so low in THC you can't get high off of it, there's no psychoactive effect, why not be as broad as we can, keeping it with some certain parameters to allow citizens to have access to it?
Well, I think that, for me, that begs the obvious question, which is, why have any qualifying conditions at all? Why not just eliminate all of them?
And we considered that, Representative Coomer.
I'm not saying I would support that.
No,
I'm asking the question, why not?
And we considered that, and again, in an abundance of caution to make sure that we're to deal with the concern that this is, and I believe just a perceived idea that this is a slippery slope. We thought, okay, well, let's be consistent with what's done in other states. Let's start there, and then add a couple that we thought there was some research showing that there was some potential benefit. And so we felt like this was the prudent and expeditious manner to take the first step. Let's make sure we limit the qualifications, that they're broad enough to help as many citizens as possible, but that there is a cap. The fact of the matter is, in many other medical marijuana states, the big catch-all is chronic pain. 90% of the diagnoses that go are chronic pain. And we understand that that's a concern, that people don't want us to become California, where all of a sudden, I got a headache, so therefore I can get cannabis. And so while a couple of these disorders would technically probably be considered chronic pain, we felt like by listing them as a specific diagnosis, that kept us from going down a potential avenue that would be too broad, if you will.
Well, and I appreciate that. My concern is that particularly with 48 and 49, there may be other, line 48, line 49, PTSD and autism, and there may be others on here that I'm not as familiar with, that you are essentially eliminating any logical limitation on you've got a list here that doesn't seem to be connected. All of these things don't seem to be connected logically back to the underlying purpose of eliminating pain and suffering, because I can't see, you haven't shown me yet anyway, the connection for PTSD and autism to benefit from this particular use. And if the policy of the state should be, well, we really shouldn't have any limitation, it should be, since nobody's getting high, and the benefit that we're trying to provide is not really about feeling good, it's about controlling uncontrollable side effects of diseases or effects that can't be controlled in a better way, then I begin to wonder, is the list really meaningful at all? Is there a purpose for the list?
Well, again, I would say, one, to be prudent, we want to contain it. And secondly, we want to be consistent with what's done in other states. I'm not sure that we, on this first step, that we want to go into new territory. Maybe we do. If that's the will of this committee, we'll do that. With sickle cell anemia, I think we'd probably be the first state that would be doing that, and maybe that's the prudent, right thing to do. But I believe that having a list, having it contained, I think is a little more prudent move for us. I may defer and ask that you would ask that question to our medical marijuana expert who's here today, who may could answer that particular question about PTSD and autism.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Ramsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Peake, for your dedication to the cause here. It's just been phenomenal watching you work this issue over the last year and a half. Your PowerPoint kind of illuminating some of the concerns we can expect to hear later from the law enforcement community. I'm curious, over the course of your study over the last year, in the states where cannabis oil is in use, is there any evidence that it's being used recreationally? Is there a market for cannabis oil for recreational users?
Well, in the 11 states that have, we say, rich CBD rather than high CBD legislation, no, you can't get high off the stuff. People that want to get this product and get a cannabis oil product that's less than 5%, and want to get high off of it, are going to be sorely disappointed. And so, in fact, if they wanted to even took a bunch of it, thinking they're taking more of it, all they're going to do is get a bad case of the runs. Quite frankly, it's olive oil, is the major component. So no, to answer your question, no.
So, if we're looking at marijuana use from a recreational user's perspective,
they're not coming after cannabis oil.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's a supply and demand market like anything else, and there's absolutely no demand for this oil type the form of cannabis, and on the supply side, it doesn't seem like people are having a real hard time that want to smoke marijuana, find a way to get it, to the point that they've got to figure out this loophole to start transporting cannabis oil. It just it seems like a hypothetical problem, but not something that in a million years would be a practical and real problem in the
people that want to get high are going to go to any street corner on any city in our state and find some weed, and that's what they're going to smoke. They're not going to be looking for cannabis oil, I can assure you that.
Thank you.
Before I recognize Chairman Setzler, we have made several calls about the temperature of the room.
Just thought it was maybe me on the hot seat. I'm everybody else.
We've made a lot of Mr. Setzler.
Representative Peake, I tell you, I appreciate your advocacy on medical cannabis oil. I think it's I too support medical cannabis oil as a medical solution. I think it's something we need to do. I'm concerned. I wanted to express a concern as I read the bill, as I understand the issue of sort of merging two terms they're distinct, but sometimes are used interchangeably. That's medical cannabis and medical cannabis oil. There's the crux of the bill, there's the operative parts of the bill, then there's the other parts that are perhaps aspirational or that are directional in terms of the commission that's going to study General Assembly finds and declares. I've got concerns that there's really three things that I see. There's recreational cannabis, there's medical cannabis, and then there's medical cannabis oil. I see them as three distinctly different things. I personally don't support medical cannabis. I support medical cannabis oil. And I'm going to, as we listen to the
Hello. The night the lights went out in Georgia.
It's
I'd say a move do pass, Mr. Chairman. That's a sign.
hope
I think, yeah.
I'm not sure I was illuminating that issue very well. Yeah.
I share about the three parts that you were.
Yeah, I share that with you because I'm concerned as we read sort of the direction we're going, not just in the vernacular but in statute, that we're setting a direction that it's the policy of the state that medical cannabis is important to the state of Georgia. I personally don't believe medical cannabis is important to the state of Georgia. I believe medical cannabis oil is important to the state of Georgia, but not medical cannabis. And we're using. I don't know that I don't think it's intentional, but I think there's this tendency to use those two interchangeably. And as we're making policy statements, the General Assembly finds and declares, I'm reading on line 89, that the extensive study of medical cannabis has revealed need to establish the safe, effective, timely regulatory model for cultivation, processing, and distribution of medical cannabis for certain debilitating illnesses. I don't support medical cannabis for debility. You know, I support medical cannabis oil for those illnesses. And as we go through this, I'd raise that to you as just maybe something you could comment on. I would raise it to committee members that there are two distinct options, not one, and that we're clear in the bill. You know, I know as Governor Mario Cuomo of New York was famous for saying, we debate, we campaign in verse, and we govern in prose. I want to be real clear that when we're writing law, that we're very clear about what we mean and what we don't mean, and that if we're limiting the scope to medical cannabis oil, both in what's regulated, in action levels and percentages, and in study commission's direction and mandate and the policy direction of the state, that we make a clear distinction, that those not be used interchangeably. I want to get your thoughts on it.
My thoughts will be this. I think the mandate of the commission is come up with the best regulatory structure for the growth, production, processing, distribution of cannabis. I think it's been very clear, I've been very clear, that I did not want to allow smoking in any form or fashion. But there are advances in technology in the application of cannabis to the point now that, you know, little breath strips that you can take, Listerine strips, that cannabis can be produced and put in that for someone who maybe has a reaction to the oil. There is actually suppositories now that can be taken for cannabis, believe it or not, that may have a better application than oil. And so while then we don't want to limit the commission of finding out what's the best application and the best model for our state, and so that's why we left it at that level of cannabis rather than just studying cannabis oil, if that makes sense.
And Mr. Chairman, I raise that because I think, you know, I think the impetus and the interest that's gotten such consensus around this is around the impact of CBD and CBD's impact. I don't think anyone on either side of the issue claimed to understand what there is about CBD that does that, you know, pharmacologically or otherwise. I just think there's a sense that CBD is what we're trying to make happen. I certainly support that, and I'm with you, and I'll hold my hand high in that respect. I would differ, though, and I don't know that we're in the same place. We may be in a different place on this, and I don't know where the members of the committee are or where the members of the legislature are. But I'm, from a policy perspective, I think it's the right direction for the state to have a CBD study effort to see how that can be deployed and used. I don't think we're to the place where I've certainly not been convinced that THC as a potential medical remedy in its own right is where the discussion's been. The discussion's been around CBD, not around THC as a medical substance in its own right. And I think the idea, whether you're talking about, you know, an oral delivery system or otherwise, through non-oil-based applications, I don't think that's where the discussion's going. I don't think that's where we've gotten the sense of consensus. And as I read through this, just in the spirit of cooperation, the spirit of advancing the CBD effort, there's a lot of sections here where I read the bill, where I read medical cannabis, and I would say I agree with that if you remove medical cannabis and put in medical cannabis oil, but medical cannabis appears in places that I don't think are consistent with what most members think we're doing, what members of the public think we're doing, or the public discourse around this issue would represent. And I think it's important that we, as members of the committee, are able to kind of parse those terms in an important way.
One final comment I
Sure.
give to that is the great thing is the commission's going to make a recommendation. It'll still be up to the will of this General Assembly and the governor of the state to decide whether it's going to move forward with whatever that recommendation is. So.
One point I'd make, Mr. Peake, is that, just to put a finer point on it, is that some of the language in the commission portion of the bill is presumptive in terms of licensing, regulation,
That's correct.
growing.
Yeah.
I don't think that presumption exists as it relates to whether it's a 3-tier system or whatever tier
Or
system.
state regulated system.
Or whatever it may be. I think there is probably consensus on, if the General Assembly goes forward with this bill, and I believe it will, I think there is a presumption on the distribution of said oil and how best to effectuate that.
Sure.
But I don't think we've come to the point of presumption on, and that's not argumentative. And it's not as if that that's a no. It's just I don't think we're at that point yet. I think it's to determine what is the best way to distribute this particular type of oil that may not include a full-fledged regulatory system, because I think that that itself is quite a leap.
Okay.
It's a different conversation, but it's in the context of the commission and the presumption language that's in there, and we may need to discuss that. But I think we are on the same page with regard to distribution on the oil and what's the most effective.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Mr. Gravely, and then Mr. Hightower.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm using up a good bit of my hour. I've got a gentleman here that's got a lot of good testimony that can give to us. I sure don't want to take away too much of his. He came all the way from Colorado, so.
We'll have Mr. Gravely, Mr. Hightower, Mr. Atwood. We'll try to expedite those questions, and then we'll see where we are.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can actually defer my question to Mr. Stanley if
Okay.
the Chairman will
Sold.
allow.
Mr. Hightower, thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm on a roll. Mr. Atwood.
Just a couple of questions. Again, thank you, Representative Peake, for carrying this. I thought it was very, very, very brave, frankly. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, I want to be sure I understand this. Less than 5% THC, you couple it with a minimum of 1.1 CBD. Is there peer-reviewed research that says that doesn't make you high? Or research that says it doesn't make you high?
I don't know that I could tell you right now, put my hands on it, but our expert witness may be able to tell us a little bit more about that. Again, we derived a good bit of that just from the boots on the ground experience with the 17 families and several other citizens who have participated in medical cannabis.
And I've spoken to some of those families with your assistance. I'm just wondering if there was, in fact, that kind of research. And on the list that you have from cancer to Tourette's, are all those things listed? Do you have at least some research that shows that they would provide some, receive some positive impact from using
that is correct.
cannabinol?
That's correct, yes, sir. We do have research. It is here. I didn't want to overload the committee with the burden of all this paperwork, but I'll be more than glad to make that available too. We can give it to you in electronic version as well too.
I think that would be helpful because that is going to go to an issue that obviously opponents are going to bring up. That's a focal point of opposition. So let me ask you to go ahead and bring your guest up for
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
between 10 and 15
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman, you want me to stay here or would you?
It's up to you.
Come on, we'll sit here together.
Welcome. Let me ask you just to let us know who you are and what you do. And
Yeah.
we've got about
Everybody
10
hear
to
me
15 minutes in
I'll make it
total
real
for
quick.
yours, and then if we would try to squeeze in some questions. But so the more brief you can be, the better. That way members can go ahead and ask you some questions.
Absolutely.
Thank
My name
you.
is. Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. My name is Jesse Stanley. I'm from the Realm of Caring Foundation in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I've got something here. I'll just read it. Forgive me for just looking down. That way we make it quick and you can ask questions. My brothers and I are known for developing Charlotte's Web and treating children with intractable epilepsy. Not many people know that we also work with many adults suffering from many different medical conditions and diseases. When we started in our industry, our primary focus was with cancer patients, and more specifically, cancer patients who were seeking cannabis to offset the side effects of chemotherapy. It's important to note that there's been over 20,000 published studies on cannabis as a treatment for some of these diseases. During that time, we also developed products for people suffering from MS, Parkinson's, and autoimmune disorders, such as Crohn's disease and many more, which are on your list. While much of the media has been focused on the therapeutic benefits of CBD and products like Charlotte's Web for children with epilepsy, not as much has been mentioned about the benefits of THC for other disease states. So far, 11 states have enacted an emergency bill which is intended to allow people safe access to CBD. which is very important to those with intractable epilepsy, as we know. However, there are so many people who can benefit from THC as well, and in those CBD-only states, there are people suffering with certain diseases, but they are left without access to products that will help, or they risk being a criminal if they seek them. I believe that this bill in front of you now is a responsible approach to this issue. It sets a clear line between products which are intended for recreational use, which are very high in THC, and products which are sought by people who are hoping to find a treatment option for their medical problem. I also want to share just some of my experience over the past 6 years in Colorado, more specifically, specific patients who have touched a place in my heart. Susan is a cancer patient who went through intense rounds of chemotherapy. She had breast cancer. She's from a very conservative family. Her father's a Baptist minister, never used cannabis and was nervous to do so, but she was also out of options. She tried Marinol, which is a synthetic form of THC produced by pharmaceutical companies, and it had no effect. We were able to treat Susan with low levels of THC in a tincture product that was about 25 milligrams per ml of THC, which is 2.5% THC. Immediately, Susan was able to sleep, which she hadn't done in weeks. She was holding down food for the first time since she started her chemo treatment. Ultimately and sadly, cancer took Susan, but in her last couple of years that we treated her, she was actually able to be present with her family, enjoy her children, and get some semblance of a quality of life, which cancer had robbed from her. Another patient and person that we seek is Kate. Kate suffers from multiple sclerosis. She began using high levels of CBD from our Charlotte's Web products, and she was having some success, but not enough to really make a big change. We began increasing her THC level by small amounts. For the last 3 months, Kate has been using a product that is a little over 4% THC with over 10% CBD. Last week, I received a text from Kate, and it said this: no sign of MS. Tremors gone, yoga, running, lifting Cooper, who is her son. I feel like Superwoman. Seriously, thank you for all you do. Amazing. These are just a couple of examples. I could sit here for hours and tell you about many other people that are experiencing these types of effects, and they're not isolated incidents. Lastly, in Colorado and Washington State, where recreational use of cannabis is legal, it would be highly uncommon to find any plant less than 5% THC. In fact, the most commonly used products are concentrates, which go anywhere from 75% to 95%. The limit of 5% THC in this bill is responsible and will prohibit the commonly abused forms of cannabis, yet allow those who can benefit to access what may be their last treatment option, without the danger of being prosecuted as though they are criminals. Thank you for hearing me today. Please know that our resources are available to you.
Thank you. We'll have a couple of questions. Mr. Gravely.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley, very much for making the trip from Colorado. I want to make a point of clarification, or maybe at least for the committee members and those in the audience. Colorado is what's known as a full plant medical state.
Correct.
Is that correct? As we went through the study committee, and I was very fortunate to be a part of that this past summer, you hear a lot. And when the news stories were running this last year, and we saw these families and their children, the one thing I heard from constituents, and really, quite frankly, other legislators, was these stories, when we see these children with epilepsy, they're compelling. It's truly, it's an emotional pull. And I think what I found out, and I don't disagree with that, I think what I found out with the study committee, as we traveled the state, as we looked at these other diagnoses that are listed out here, and I think that's a good framework. We're actually defining the parameters here with HB1. But when I met folks like Ms. Davenport or others that we came in contact with and we heard their testimony, Ms. Crosby, those stories are just as compelling. They may not be as cute, for lack of a better term, but they're real lives as well. And the pain and the medical treatments and the families that are affected around these adults those stories are just as compelling. So what I want to say here, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, would you give a very clear, because we've been met with frustration. Obviously, HB1 is still, when you look at it across the nation, is a very limited bill. It's extremely limited. When you talk about full plant medical cannabis as opposed to what we're doing specifically with the oil, and actually define what full plant is, because there are some in the state, and the testimony that we heard over the summer, they didn't like this bill. This wasn't what they were looking for, even from a medical approach. But like you said, I believe it's a responsible bill, but I want the committee members to know, and I want those in the audience to know what the definition of full plant medical is, and kind of in your opinion, not how limited it is, but well, quite frankly, how limited we've kept this measure here in Georgia, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. Full plant cannabis is something that is usually basically open for, like Alan was saying, smoking, and different products that you can make. What we're doing, or what you're looking at trying to do, is limit that. And by limiting that, you are offering basically one type of sort of cannabis oil, which cannabidiol comes from cannabis, and we extract that from a full plant, and it's done in a lab. It's done, by obviously people much more well qualified to do that than me. But we also go through rigorous testing with that. So to ensure, with what you guys are trying to do, the ability to not abuse this, that's a really good step. So the full plant type of model that Colorado has taken is not something that you guys are looking to do, and I fully understand that and I respect that. This, however, does allow for some of these people that have these disease states to get this type of treatment and get it safely, and also to have it tested and know exactly what they're getting.
Mr. Hightower, did you have a question from before you wanted to? Okay. All right. Well, this is a good break point then. Thank you both. Appreciate it, Mr. Peak. We'll do now is call the DA's Association and Prosecuting Attorneys Council to come forward to give us their comments. All right, we'll continue the hearing on HB 1. For the second half of the hearing, we're joined by Chuck Spahas, who's the Executive Director of the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, and Danny Porter, the Gwinnett County District Attorney, on behalf of the District Attorneys Association
and Prosecuting Attorneys Council.
and Prosecuting Attorneys Council.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Danny Porter. I'm the District Attorney of the Gwinnett Judicial Circuit.
Let me ask you to pull the microphone just a little bit closer. Thank you.
I have testified at least twice before the previous committee and at least once during the summer study committee. And I'm here to say that the district attorneys of this state have presented unwavering support for the idea of cannabidiol oil in low THC concentrations for children with seizure disorders. It is a bill that I believe it was House Bill 65 last year that we helped draft, that we helped support, and that ultimately failed. However, House Bill 1 in its current form cannot be supported by the prosecutors of the state. And I'd like to first of all talk a little bit of history and a little bit of science, and then turn it over to Mr. Spahos for some specific objections we have to the language of the bill. I graduated high school in 1973. Cheech and Chong was one of my favorite comedians of the time. And according to Newsweek magazine, people were smoking joints with a marijuana THC concentrate of 0.83%. Everybody I knew smoked marijuana, and I saw a lot of people who got high. Now, we can debate the definition of high, we can debate what is high, but I think we can all have a common sense decision about that. I began prosecution in the 1980s, and I was assigned as a drug prosecutor, and at that time, the average THC content of street marijuana seized in large quantities was from 4 to 9% THC. The first statistic that I gave you was according to Newsweek magazine in their publication Weed Nation, which is a summary of the medical marijuana debate in this country. The second is from the National Office of Drug Control Policy. And in 2015, according to the Georgia State Crime Lab, the average THC level of marijuana in Georgia is between 12 and 20%. With, as Mr. Stanley said, some designer brands and some of the brands that are being used in a non-smoking form in other states being as high as 95% THC. That's normally referred to as hash oil, which is the most valuable drug per ounce on the planet, and which is a byproduct of the production of CBD oil. Representative Peek's assertion today that CBD cancels out the effects of THC is based on anecdotal data, and today is the first time we have heard that the 1-to-1 ratio actually cancels out the psychoactive effects of THC. And while we had an opportunity, I did a little bit of research. On the Pure Analytics website, February the 19th of 2012, it cited a Temple University study which in fact said that when THC and CBD are administered together, CBD prevents the metabolization of THC in the liver and actually prolongs the psychoactive effects of THC. On the National Institute of Health government website, Frontiers in Psychiatry, it cited a number of studies that says that CBD inhibits adverse mental effects of THC, citing particularly anxiety and psychosis, which are signs of the usage of high THC marijuana. We do not support the expansion of medical marijuana in this state, whether you call it cannabis oil or whether you call it smokable marijuana, and we believe that this increase in the THC level is essentially the bottom of the slippery slope. That essentially that this bill as written will legalize liquid marijuana in this state, and we do not support it. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Spahos for some specifics as to the specific bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm Chuck Spahos. I'm the Executive Director of the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, and I had the honor, I guess, to serve this summer as a member of the study committee and to listen to the testimony and to look at various aspects of this. I'm not going to go through a whole litany because we will acknowledge, and just as Representative Gravely has said, this bill's much more narrow now than it was when we started, with certain concepts that we were very concerned about no longer being in this bill. I will say this, there's some pretty startling statistics out of Colorado and Arizona and some of the states that are much further down the road than us, particularly related to traffic fatalities involving people that are under the influence of marijuana, about arrest for driving under the influence of drugs, and about access that our children have once medical marijuana becomes more readily accessible and available in a state, and that we need to move forward cautiously with that aspect in mind. In doing so, we have a few suggestions that, if this is the will of the General Assembly to go forward, we believe needs to be addressed. Specifically, in the bill, we have some concerns and potentially some suggestions. I want to start out by talking about the oil. This bill anticipates an oil with up to 5% THC. As you've all heard, that's significantly higher than anything we talked about last year. As the representative said, of the 11 states that have passed the oil, only Alabama and Iowa have gone as high as 3%. So understand that Georgia would be stepping out significantly ahead of any other state that has done a cannabinol type of process. So the data that we're relying on these states is about a different product than what is being proposed in this bill. In fact, most of the states, other than Alabama and Iowa, every other state has done something less than 1%, which is more along the lines of what we support. And quite frankly, the testimony we heard during the study committee about the effects that that substance, a low THC oil or low THC substance combined with a cannabinol, that actually counteracts a seizure that a child has. That is obviously the place we've been all along, of none of us want to stand in the way of that child or that parent administering that drug to that child. That being said, so we have that first concern, the level of THC that's being allocated in this oil. Second of all, and I want to direct the committee's attention to the first place that we use a definition is around line 53. It's where we start to define an oil, and excuse me because we're working off of a sub that we didn't have until just as this started. Although none of this has really changed. I spoke with Representative Peake earlier today, and I've been in contact with the crime lab, and we're trying to get to a language that is clearer, that is more consistent with what the scientist at the crime lab will actually test for, be able to make a determination thereof, and then ultimately testify to. And we've got some problem with the language. In fact, until I heard Representative Peake today explain the 1-to-1 ratio that I believe is what the attempt to describe in this definition is, was the first time we could actually get that concept. The chemists don't quite understand this. And I don't mean to say this in an obstructive manner. I'm saying we need to work with the author and with the crime lab to come up with language related to this oil that would be consistent with the testing process and what they would testify to. And we commit ours, obviously, to doing that. We also have some questions about the diagnosis that this represents. I back up to line 32, and quite frankly, this diagnosis by a physician is the precursor for all of this, and we're somewhat concerned about how that relates, particularly when you look at the laundry list of disorders tied back to this. For instance, I don't know how often, and again, this may be ignorance, how often a physician that I assume to be a medical doctor is the one that actually says somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe that may be in a different realm. I don't know. We have some concerns about that. We obviously had some concerns about there were no conditions or regulations anticipated about that. I will submit that this substitute does try to put together some sort of guidelines under the Department of Public Health. That being said, when we get down to the practical sides of this, I'm going to discuss some of the things that we believe need to be in there or codified and clarified for both law enforcement purposes dealing with this substance, and then of course for the prosecutors to decide what is criminal and what's not. We need some guidelines if we're going down this road. Before I do that, I just want to hit the commission at it starts at page 106, and again, as I said, I served this summer on the commission, and I've been kicked out of nicer places than this before. We do believe that the prosecutors still belong and have some say and can be helpful in this process. So we were a little disappointed that we're no longer involved in this process going forward, but that's something else that can be addressed at a later point. So finally, I want to hit a couple of practical problems that we see from a law enforcement standpoint. We do have concerns that if you were to pass this in its current form and an individual was allowed to consume this product on a regular basis to deal with whatever on this list is the disorder, and then that individual is able to have the THC level at such a point in their blood system that it does affect their motor skills, and there is some scientific study out there now that ties the higher levels in your blood system with your ability to operate a motor vehicle, and that's really where we're going. We've got some concerns that Georgia doesn't have a driving under the influence per se of marijuana. We're prepared to give you several states that have addressed this, including Washington, Nevada, Ohio, Montana, and Colorado, some of the states that are further out there ahead of us. And we're working with the crime lab about some proposed language that would do that. But if we're going to say that this substance can be in your system and can have that much of an effect on you, then once it gets to a certain level in your system, you don't need to be on the roads of this state with the rest of us. So we would ask you to at some point talk about that with us. Another problem law enforcement will have with this under its current format is that their response to marijuana in the field and dealing with it from a plant standpoint, we know how to do. We've done for a long time. There's test kits. In fact, we send police officers to school to make them experts in identifying leaf marijuana. But when we start talking about this substance that we are authorizing or that you would be authorizing, understand that there's no way to deal with that on the side of the road other than to potentially test it for positive for THC, not to quantify whether or not that substance is this low THC cannabinol. So we've got some real concerns about that. We also, we've heard the representative talk about this container and what it would look like and this certificate and what it would look like. But what we do have some concerns about is, as was pointed out, we've done this over in a different portion of the code. How do we deal with an individual that then has this substance, but it's not in the proper container? Or we have this substance and they have too much of it. What is the amount of that substance we're going to allow an individual to have or not have? And remember, we can't give an administrative authority, or we can't give an administrative body the authority to pass a rule that then is enforceable by our law enforcement as a law. This body, the General Assembly, has to say this is what's allowed or not allowed, and that's what law enforcement would react to. So we submit that we need to carefully consider that and look at how that would do. And then just one other thing that we are concerned about is the substance itself, and it will be abused. This provision will allow and, quite frankly, make popular possessing this oil. And this oil, we have some concerns when talking to the chemist about how this makes up. We've been told that this process would involve olive oil or something like that. None of that is in this code. So what I am told by my crime lab people talking to them is if you were to dilute this with something less than or something that burns off at a lower boiling rate, you could possess hash oil, quite frankly, that tested positive with cannabinol as well. And as long as it was diluted enough that it's only 5% of the substance carrying, which could be water, that while you've got it in that form, it would be fine and it would meet this standard. You could take it home and put it under heat, boil the water off of it, and have pure hash oil. It's an unintended consequence of it, and again, it's something we're just now understanding as we talk to the crime lab and the people involved in that. So those are the concerns that we bring up. Again, and I'm going to reiterate what we said from the beginning. Despite the federal law claims and the Schedule I provisions and all of those things that we have discussed throughout the year, the prosecutors of the state are not opposed to letting the children that need this oil that helps with this disorder immediately get in their hands. But we submit to you this advanced list of disorders and what have you that will have it, and this higher THC level oil, we need to really be careful about going forward because that is not as clear cut as the seizure disorders for children. I'd be glad to yield for questions.
Thank you. I appreciate both of your comments. Your point about the DUI piece is well taken as well, certainly from a practical standpoint. the ability to take the substance and, depending on the composition and temperature, burn it off, and then all of a sudden you've been able to camouflage something that's obviously a heck of a lot stronger than what's contemplated here. And those are both points very well taken, and look forward to working with you on language, I suppose in conjunction with the crime lab.
Yes.
And I suppose with the narcotics agency as well, for their expertise to come together and make sure we've got it correct.
Yes.
Going back on the THC level, the 0.8, going back to 885 from last year, and then contrasting where we are now and what at least this particular substitute has. I mean, and I hear you, and I know that it was a long slog for the prosecutor, for law enforcement in general, on the bill last year, and finally got to that point, and it was narrowly tailored for children, and that's really how the issue began. But what I'm not understanding, though, is the full nature of law enforcement's objection on why we should hold back on providing this tool, and it's a tool,
Sure.
for adults who have very similar disorders, which is not to say that the laundry list of conditions that are in the substitute is what will be the final list. But for those conditions that clearly make sense in the context of how we've discussed it in the juvenile context, the seizure disorders, MS, Crohn's, mitochondrial, the spasticity, fibromyalgia, Parkinson's. I mean, those intuitively make sense. Why would we not do that for adults that are suffering, just as we have clearly intended we started this in the juvenile context?
Mr. Chairman, if I could,
Yeah.
I think it really has to do with two things. Number one is last year, prosecutors were willing to accept the anecdotal evidence of an actual treatment for seizure disorder with the high CBD oil, a reduction in the number of seizures, or an improvement in condition. And therefore, even though it was only anecdotal, and many people were saying there was no scientific basis for it, we thought that it was important that in that circumstance that aid be brought to children as soon as possible. When we get into the high THC oil, and I'll use PTSD as an example. PTSD is a psychological condition caused by the survival of a traumatic event that manifests itself in certain physical symptoms, including sleeplessness, anxiety, other suicidal thoughts, other psychological thoughts. Low CBD oil has no effect on PTSD because it does not reduce the anxiety, and therefore that's an example of THC oil being a palliative. In other words, something that makes you feel better. And our position on this is that we have now gone further out into the realm of anecdotal, non-scientific evidence that in the letter that you'll hear from the Chiefs Association cites all of the scientific organizations that don't support use of marijuana. And I guess, to put it as simply as I can, you have to get high to treat PTSD. And that's why we oppose it. If you look at all the other conditions, with very few exceptions, they fall under the chronic pain exception. Chronic pain causes anxiety. Most pain patients are on anti-anxiety medication. As a result, THC substitutes for those already accepted, medically accepted, quality-controlled, FDA-approved anti-anxiety medication.
I can appreciate your comments as it relates to PTSD, but on many of the conditions that are listed in the current substitute, there's pain, and there's chronic pain, including seizures or potential seizures that go along with it. So
I'm not arguing with that. I'm saying that the marijuana that is suggested, it's never prescribed, it's always suggested that you might be a person that marijuana could help, even in marijuana legal states in Colorado. Marijuana is something that might help you, and the marijuana helps you because of the THC, because it reduces anxiety and it reduces the perception of pain.
Reduces the
it's a
perception of pain or
it's a
reduces the pain?
It doesn't reduce the pain.
Okay.
It's herbal Xanax.
All right. I think that's a key. That's a key point of contention, probably.
I suspect it is.
Mr. Pack.
Yes, sir. I want to talk about this issue of kind of the reverse kind of chemistry to raise the content a little second. If someone were to do that, assuming that there is an economic incentive or some type of a personal use incentive to do so, if they raise the content, if we pass the bill the way it is, it's above 5%, no matter how you cut it, would that already be illegal under the law?
I think that is I think that's the reason that they've attempted to take this and extract this low percentage THC. I mean, arguably, when the THC gets above that, it now falls back in the definition of marijuana that we've got prohibitions about. So, yes, I think the answer to your question is yes, that would be punishable. Our point is, how is law enforcement going to be able to deal with that on the side of the road when you can't quantitate?
Well, I get that. I'm trying to look at it. There's no street test to test for concentration right now, and I completely understand it. But my point is, I'm trying to understand your argument that they're going to abuse it because they're going to buy all this oil, setting aside that transporting it from Colorado here is against federal law, and then boil it or whatever, chemically engineer it to raise the content. Then we know that's already against the law, right?
Right.
So passing this bill allowing less than 5% wouldn't really impact that, or it's not going to lead to more of that, because that shouldn't be the reason not to pass the law, because it's already illegal, the conduct that you're complaining about.
Yes and no. You also got to understand now you're going into how does the oil get here and where does it come from? Another thing.
Mr. Spearhouse, my question was, I'm trying to understand your slippery slope argument, because this is kind of important to me, because I don't want it to be abused, whatever we pass. You said that someone could take the oil and then boil it or use some type of heat it to increase the concentration above 5%. Okay, that's already against the law, right? If they wanted to do that, they could do that now, right? So how is passing this law encouraging that behavior?
It increases their ability to transport it in a legal format, is what I'm trying to get at. You could have your hash oil, which you were going to extract from a plant or bring in from another state, and the extraction process is a whole nother issue and a whole nother danger to this process. You can now dilute it far enough and transport it, is our point. You could have this medical card, you could have one of these conditions, and you could take your hash oil and dilute it enough to transport it. And then when you get it wherever you're going to distribute it, then you could pull the cutting agent or water or whatever else back out of it. That was the point of the conversation.
And Mr. Pack, and that addresses one of the issues of the bill. The bill doesn't limit individual possession.
Mm-hmm. I understand that, and which kind of relates to the second question I wanted to have. And I wasn't present in all the commission hearings. In terms of we're redefining what marijuana is under state law, I don't know if this was ever explored. Is it subject to challenge of, I know if we mess with the schedules, I think there's some inconsistency with federal law. The question is, do we have as a state, without being subject to challenge as to preemption, to redefine what is marijuana without triggering some other type of issues? And that's a legal issue, not really in the science.
You as a state can say that you're going to schedule it different, but that does not change the fact that the federal government has scheduled it as Schedule 1 and has federal statutes that prohibit the possession, use, and whatever else of Schedule 1. So there's nothing that this body can do to change the fact that any of this, quite frankly, is going to violate. An individual with this substance would still be in violation of federal law.
Right. But what we can do is, if we exclude the enforcement mechanism, so possession with intent to distribute, and exclude this behavior from that, we will not run into issues that being inconsistent with federal law, correct?
You can prevent me from prosecuting this. You can't prevent the feds from prosecuting.
Okay. Thanks.
Mr. Hightower.
The one of the concerns that I had when I was going through this bill is dealing with the registration card. Right now, I mean, I enjoy the purpose of this bill and agree with the purpose of the bill and where it's trying to get. But one thing that did concern me was there's no real teeth if you don't have the registration card. If you have the registration card and you have one of these symptoms, then you can have this in your possession. But there's nothing in this bill that I'm reading that says if you have these conditions and you don't have the card, but you have the oil, what happens to you? And I think the reason we're going the registration card is because it's Schedule 1, we can't do a prescription for it.
That's correct.
So we've come up with this registration process so that we can kind of see who has this and make sure they have it lawfully. What I'd like to see, though, is something that's done there that says there needs to be some type of requirement for this registration. If you don't have the registration, then there could be certain sanctions against you, criminally possibly. But playing off that, going to one of your other concerns, this is kind of part 2 of my issue. That was one of the concerns. This one goes kind of against one of your concerns a little bit, and this is the marijuana per se. And you were saying, you know, after you reach a certain level, you want a marijuana per se. We had marijuana per se in Georgia for quite some time. Our courts ruled that unconstitutional, that you couldn't have marijuana per se. You can still have, in Georgia, DUI less safe based on drugs, which is what this would be prosecuted under. And I don't see the big argument that a lot of law enforcement's making, that I don't see how you correlate your logic on these, is we already have a lot of medications that are derived from plants that have hallucinogenic effects that we prescribe on a daily basis, and they're prescribed. And the way that we combat driving under the influence on those is we put on the bottle, do not operate a motor vehicle, and we prosecute those people through our laws. We have in our DUI code section that says if you're driving under the influence of these things, then you can be prosecuted for DUI. Now, we don't, even on those, we don't prosecute those through DUI per se. We prosecute those through DUI less safe. So I think we have a mechanism for prosecuting those that drive on this. I don't think per se is the way to go because our courts have already said they're not going to do it that way. But I guess I'm not understanding the big, strong holdup that y'all have, because y'all are able to effectively, to a large degree, regulate the illegal use of these current medications. And I know there's a big problem with those, because I mean, you know, I'm in this area. I know there's a big problem with it, but our laws are something. I mean, we regulate those now. Why is this so much different when all the testimony we're hearing doesn't show that this has near the side effects? Because I've seen people who have been high on oxycodone or Oxycontin. I mean, those folks, they're completely unfunctional. I mean, they can't see, they can't talk. I've had people that I've represented in cases that were shoplifting and don't even remember being in the Walmart. But we're not getting near the same response when we say, okay, we're going to leave it at 5% or less. Everything we're hearing is saying they're not getting anything like that. Do you see what I'm saying? We're already dealing with things where we allow it now, and this has much less side effects, but yet we're trying to regulate it so much harsher. Now, I do agree, though, going back, that we need to regulate who has the card. But there's a gap there in the logic that y'all have, in my opinion.
Okay, if I could address each one of those issues. When we had a marijuana per se statute that was struck, that statute was struck because we said the mere presence of marijuana in the blood alone was sufficient. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're proposing here, and that's not what the other states have proposed. Obviously, science has come a long way since that time. What we now know, and there's studies to support this, is at a certain level of marijuana in your system, it is accepted that that amount of marijuana will affect anybody's ability to do certain things. Mm-hmm. It's the same concept that ultimately got to 0.08 in alcohol. Sure. We got to where we believe, and there's scientific studies to establish that anybody at 0.08 is now affected and can effectively operate a vehicle. So that's why we've drawn that standard. It's interesting because several states that have gone this route, I only pulled the marijuana statutes out because that's what we were discussing, but several of these states have done comprehensive per se statutes now to deal with the same problem we're dealing with in the state, is all the people that are driving under the influence of controlled substances that they have a legitimate prescription to, and they set per se amounts in their statute that's based on what their crime lab and other people come testify are the scientifically accepted facts. So that's the distinction between the old days and now. It's also the distinction between what we're talking about as far as a per se count. We're saying, as have these other states, is that if we're going to give people more access to this drug, which I believe we would find other people would testify otherwise, that the THC is still the active ingredient in this substance, and that's why they want that level so high, that it has an effect on your body, and it has an effect on your mind, and it has an effect on your ability to do certain things. And what we're saying is, if we're going to say, yes, you can have it because you're in that much pain or you're suffering from this debilitating disease, that's fine. We want to give you what will help you get past that and deal with that. But we don't want you to take that and then get out on the road with me, you, or our family. Sure. And that's where we're at.
Mr. Strickland, did you have a question?
Well, it's kind of the same point that Representative Hightower was
Let
making.
me push your button. Oh, thank you.
It's kind of the same point Representative Hightower was making, but if I take any prescribed drug or any drug over the counter, have too much of it, and get behind the wheel today, I could be pulled over and found guilty of a DUI, right, under the less safe to drive statute.
You didn't give me enough facts to support
Right,
that.
right. But is it not true that it's actually easier to convict someone of less safe DUI than it is necessarily 0.08, because it's going to be up to me to prove that I was actually safe to drive. I think it makes no sense to now try to set some sort of guideline for a level of oil. We don't have the same guidelines for other medicines that are out there right now.
Well, you make my argument for that we now have scientific, reliable evidence about where those levels should be on the conditions you're discussing. I mean, I've probably tried more of these cases than anybody in the room, and to make a blanket statement that they're easier or not, that's not true. In fact, sometimes it's very difficult to prosecute a case, even when you've got significant less safe acts, when the defense to it is, well, my doctor gave me this pills and I was taking it along the lines of what they said. What we're saying is the science is now to the point where we know what those levels are that make you not safe, and that is no different than we know that 0.08 is a point that makes you not safe.
Don't we know that for other medicines as well, though?
We do. I can submit you a list of where we would be comfortable adding per se amounts on hydrocodone, oxycontin.
But my point is, I think that's a separate issue that could be addressed separately. I don't think it's a reason to hold up this bill. I think this is a medicine like all medicines out there that can be abused. And the idea of holding up this bill because we want to set this DUI level for this one medicine doesn't make any sense to me.
At a later point, I'd be glad to bring a drug recognition expert in here to tell you the difference in how marijuana manifests itself and how hard it is to detect in field sobriety tests as opposed to alcohol. And that's one of the challenges to investigating and prosecuting those cases. And it's why we've had to create a whole new approach and, quite frankly, a elevated level of investigator that does those cases now. So there is a definite distinction between marijuana and alcohol, for definite.
Thank you.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes you get to ask questions you know the answers to, and you just make yourself look smart. Sometimes you have to ask questions you don't know the answers to, and you just look like what you look like. So I've got 3 questions I don't know the answers to. And I can take an answer. Well, I can take an answer now or later on is fine, before our next committee meeting. Question number 1: would there be any federal money that flows to the state, grant money or otherwise, I guess grant money, for law enforcement purposes that might be affected by the state changing its definition of a schedule substance so that it is now inconsistent with the federal law? That's question number 1. Question number 2: is there an FDA supervised or FDA approved study that shows a connection, and this is not just to you gentlemen at the table, this is for all the players in the room. Is there a FDA supervised or FDA approved study that shows a connection between the product described in HB1 and each of the 17 conditions listed in HB1? And then the third question is there any scientific data or peer-reviewed data or FDA-sanctioned studies or anything that we can rely on scientifically with results that show that the THC and CBD ratio of 1-to-1 prevents intoxication in users. And in particular, I'm asking this question because I go back to the presentation earlier, and there's a page in the presentation that says there's a claim of no scientific evidence, not enough clinical trials proving medical efficacy. And then there are responses to that claim, but none of those responses are scientific evidence. They're all anecdotal evidence. So I'd like to see if there is scientific evidence. If there's not, just tell me there's not, and let's make a decision based on what facts we have. So you can answer them now or later. Doesn't matter to me.
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer the first question.
That's probably a fact-gathering process that we just have to go ahead and do on our own.
I know there was something in the last appropriations bill at a federal level that addressed federal grant money, but I think it was more of a prohibition about implementation of these programs. I don't have that language in front of me. One of the problems we've had through this whole process is the lack of scientific data to take this substance through the regular process of going through and being approved and being not scheduled as one and scheduled at a lower level so that this could just be a prescription medication. So that's obviously already a problem. And as far as the scientific data on THC and CBC, today was the first time I'd ever heard that. Now that may very well mean I'm ignorant on that fact, but that's the first time I'd ever heard that it reduces the effect.
Thank you.
Ms. Dickerson.
Mrs. Spearhouse, how you doing today?
Good.
Great. I have a question. You are concerned, does the prosecuting attorneys have any objections to the number of disorders? Because you talked about that earlier, and I just want to make sure that all of the disorders stay in the bill. That's important to me.
I will say this from participating in this study committee. I've heard nothing but stories from individuals that say that use of marijuana helps them with this. I've seen not the scientific studies or anything that support that on this laundry list. I'll be honest with you, I haven't even seen that in the seizure disorders for children. But there was no doubt about the testimony and the changes in those children's lives and the lack of seizures. That's why we all bought into this. A lot of this becomes a lot more anecdotal. So no, I do not have, nor have I seen any scientific reliable evidence. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying I haven't seen it for this laundry list of disorders.
And remember, Ms. Dickerson, our contention is that it's the level of THC that determines whether or not the marijuana oil is effective on a particular condition.
Okay.
And that's really the crux of it, is how far do you want to go in that process.
Mr. Setzler, last question for these two witnesses, and then Mr. Rotundo and Mr. Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to address what Mr. Porter just said. The CBD is a remedy for horrible and acute seizure conditions, I think is what got us here. And again, you may be in an uncomfortable place to testify on something you would call scientific or research-based, but I do know you've done some homework on this. Is there anything you've seen that would suggest that CBD is dangerous to people, that CBD has any kind of, this is a rhetorical question, CBD really has no deleterious effect? Anything?
In looking at the research that I've looked at over the last, since the summer, there are physical effects to high CBD concentrations being administered orally. There's nausea, there's diarrhea, but I don't think there are any psychological or physical effects to that. I think what happens is at least from the research I've looked at, is it either works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't work, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. And I asked the question because in the context of, and I'm no expert in this area, to be sure, I know there's a drug that's out there that's in some phase of experimentation, Epidiolex, that's a 0.03% THC that's seeking to have the CBD effects for people. It's being tested, and I think it's produced in Britain. The people in this room probably understand that very well. What evidence have you seen that for people with seizure disorders that a 0.5%, 0.8% THC content in what is in essence a CBD oil i.e. lower THC, is less effective than something that's a 4.0%, 5%. If you've seen anything in your research that suggests higher THC helps people who have seizure conditions who are really taking the oil to remedy those?
I can't answer that. I can't answer that question.
Okay. Because, Mr. Chairman, my question was the same, was that there's the CBD, the desire to legalize CBD for seizure conditions, and then there's THC, as what Mr. Porter represented, as a palliative effect for 17 other conditions, or 16 other conditions. I mean, to me, that's the substance of the discussion here. This is no longer a debate about CBD for seizure conditions. I think there's probably unanimity on this panel about that. The policy question that seems to be before the committee is, are we going to support 5% THC in an oil-based form for post-traumatic stress, Alzheimer's, chronic pain, and those kind of that's really where I think the policy debate centers. And that's
Mr. Stetzler, in California, with a marijuana card, you can get up to 6 ounces a month for chronic pain, which includes leg cramps, muscle soreness. Every personal trainer in California has a marijuana card. You get up to 6 ounces a month of whole plant product. You got to decide when you want to go there.
No, thank you. I mean, I think what we're aiming toward is exactly what Governor Deal said in his State of the State address, I think it was, where we want to provide the mechanism whereby individuals, and he did not narrow it to children, whereby individuals who are suffering can get relief without actually, just as they have in Colorado, without becoming Colorado. So that's the threading of the needle, and so we're conscious of that, and I think certainly the governor is too from his comments. Let me thank you both for being here. We appreciate the comments. We know, I think it's important that we know what the challenges are and what the basis of opposition is, and hopefully we can work toward consensus.
As always, Mr. Chairman, we look forward to working with you.
Let me ask Mr. Rotundo and Mr. Norris to come forward if they could. I know Mr. Rotundo is. I don't know. Mr. Norris, are you going to come up or no? Whoever, sure. I mean, y'all run in packs anyway, right? Sure, sure. I'm not going to cut you off right at 4, but we probably need to expedite it a little bit. Thank you, Chairman Atwood. Thank you. No problem. Whoever wants to go first, just remind us who you are and who you represent. And if you could keep your comments limited so we could go ahead and just err on the side of Q&A, appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my name is Frank Vincent Rotundo. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police. I started in law enforcement in January 1969. The marijuana period was a little bit different than it is now in '69. Now, I want to, first of all, thank Representative Allen Peake. I sincerely mean that. He was willing to work with everybody. I was part of the committee that was able to testify during the summer. He's made every attempt to make this bill whole, to make everybody happy. But regretfully, I think a change occurred, and it was a dynamic change, when it went from under 18 children to over 18 for different types of ailments, a potpourri of illnesses, where my association, the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police, my executive board itself, which has the voting authority for the 1,000 people who belong to that association, mostly police chiefs and command staff, basically without anybody's dissent on that, said that HB1 now in its current form is a bad bill. Now, it's contrary to the scientific evidence, it's contrary to the medical community's statements, and it's contrary to federal law. Now, I provided to your office, Mr. Chairman, a document. It was a 3-page document I ask you to share that with the members of the committee at your convenience if you have not already. So I won't go too deep into that, but I could tell you that we're looking at marijuana, which is a Schedule 1 FDA type of drug, and basically there's no medical worth that the FDA finds with it, no scientific validation studies involved in that, and the FDA basically said that all forms of marijuana is inherently dangerous. So now what we're doing now in our state and what has been done in 23 others is we're looking at a way of relieving pain and rightfully so, and seizure disorders to children, basically. That's how Haley's Hope started, as Representative Peake said. And now we're segueing into the idea of adult pain. Some of that pain could be deemed to be subjective in nature, as I think you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, based upon an analysis of the doctor in conjunction with the patient. That doesn't mean the pain doesn't exist. It is just subjective. But there's nothing to really say that it controls the pain. We have a lot of FDA-approved drugs that controls pain with adults that has proven worth. Now, I'd like to just center in on something that was mentioned several times to me by my colleagues. It's called the DOJ's Cole Memorandum. And if you're not familiar with that, for the members of the committee...
Mr. Rotundo, let me interrupt you, and I apologize. We know that we are not relying to our detriment on the Cole Memorandum. I can assure you of that.
Okay.
I mean, please give us a little more credit than that.
Okay, well thank you. Then allow me to say that the Attorney General nominee has basically said, Ms. Lynch has basically said that she will enforce marijuana laws more diligently. A lot of my information on Haley's Hope and the marijuana comes from Colorado. And what happened in Colorado, you went to medical marijuana, then you went to basically the legalization of marijuana. So we saw a stepping stone. And I think that that's what we don't want to see in this state. And we're fearful of that. Some of the side effects of that happen to be that the studies were very costly, a lot more costly than expected to be. I think there was a projection of $1 million, and it turned out to be $12.1 million in Colorado. But every national medical association, and some in Georgia, such as the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, National Multiple Sclerosis, and the list goes on. And there's a litany of the list in your document that I provided to you, which said there's no therapeutic value, except one, which says basically it may segue into the use of marijuana, and that it does have some psychotic effects. Now, we do have to draw the line between the cannabis oil and the marijuana, but I could tell you that it's very closely tied. And when I started to think a little bit about what the prosecutor said and having some prior thoughts as what I wanted to project here today, I was very concerned about the DUIs, which is obviously a concern that everybody has here. How do you prove DUIs? Do you want people to drive with marijuana in their system in a less safe manner? And since there really is no standard form of a test for that, it becomes a little bit of a problem. Plus, we know that THC levels stay in your body for approximately 30 days. It would be very difficult to look at that. So we have to rely upon the less safe aspect at all. There was a statement made, which is very true, that the governor has basically said we're not going to segue into legalization of marijuana, but that's our current governor now, who will be here for certainly 4 more years. I don't have any idea what's going to happen after that if we leave the opening here for people more than 18.
I do.
Okay.
I do, and we do.
Okay. Well, I hope you're right, sir. I mean,
yeah, I mean, there is a sense and there's a continuity that occurs in the General Assembly, and that's why we have a separation of powers.
Thank you.
Okay.
That would be fine.
Okay.
I also want to point to something that happened a while back, just a couple legislative sessions ago, dealing with pill mills. We started to see the prescription aspect of pills being done by doctors, and then the pill mills selling that material, which turned out to be just a wholesale distributed effect. So I'd like you to be conscious of the possibility of kind of bootlegged type of oils and marijuana. In Colorado, what basically happened is organized crime people actually stepped forward and are selling traditional marijuana to people who have prescriptions for marijuana because it's cheaper. So we had an undercurrent of people purchasing illegal marijuana, and therefore the tax money that was supposed to be generated by the marijuana was far less. I could continue to go on, but I could tell you that the Colorado governor, Hickenlooper is his name, he said that the marijuana statutes are reckless. And that was his point on it. Please, I ask you to refer to the correspondence at your convenience. Certainly know that this is not a closed situation with the association. We would have not said anything except for the fact that it went into over 18 and the concentration levels changed. I think that we presented our case at the summer committee as to what our concerns were. I think that the original bill addressed some of those concerns, and the commitment of the author did. This is a difficult decision for people sitting on this committee, and it's going to be a difficult decision for everybody if a law in fact does pass. And I feel comfortable something will pass, but let's try to mitigate it.
Okay.
I'm
Mr.
sure
Rotundo, I have a lot of respect for your background and your career, and we've worked together on other issues, but to be candid with you, your testimony here as well as your letter is essentially a slippery slope argument, and it is a sky is falling. This is just going to lead to some, lead to Denver, and and this is what we're going to become in 5-10 years. And I don't know that really has as much substantive credibility with the committee as some would think. On the more scientific medical points, those are valid, and we understand that. And the question for us is how and where do we draw the lines on particular conditions, if we do. But what I will tell you, just speaking for myself, is that we're not very receptive to you're going to become Colorado, you can become Colorado, therefore do nothing. So we may just agree to disagree on that, and that's okay, but I would just offer that to you. I'm going to go ahead and distribute your letter as per your request. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and recognize Mr. Norris to take as short a time as he humanly can to open up time for questions, and then we'll march on from there. But this is a to be continued, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm accustomed to being brief because my sheriffs say be brief or be gone. I'm Terry Norris. I'm Executive Director of the Sheriff's Association. I've provided a little short statement that I was going to read, but in the interest of brevity, I will go ahead and say this. For the record, the sheriffs would like for me to repeat what Representative Peake and you all have said, and that is the sheriffs are adamantly opposed to the legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes. For the record, we want to say that. They too want to know, you all to know, that they will oppose any effort to cultivate. That's down the road for any purpose. Last year, with Mr. Peake's bill, the sheriffs conceded their position. They're troubled by the talk of any legalization, as you might guess. But they conceded that position after having heard from families of children with seizure disorders. And they said, yes, we will not oppose a bill that provides this treatment, cannabis treatment, for children with seizure disorders. And that position remains today. So I guess the only thing I will say in closing, in order to be brief, is the substitute to House Bill 1, which vastly expands those series of conditions, is opposed by the sheriff. The sheriff opposed the bill. Make no mistake, though, they're not fighting the bill. It is simply their opinion that this is bad public policy. They're not the policy makers. They recognize you all are. But they want you to know on the record their position in that regard. So I will yield my absence of time, no time.
No, I appreciate the approach on that. I really do. And I appreciate the recognition of the enforcement role as opposed to the policy-making role. We all appreciate that very, very much. I think we do well to go ahead and collaborate whenever and wherever we can. It just makes things, from a practical standpoint down the road, much more seamless, much easier. We don't have to come back again and again and again to fix bad law. That's something that we are not interested in. So take some comfort in that, to my friend, Mr. Rotundo.
Well, that's okay, but you didn't lower the temperature because it's a little hot on this seat. I knew it would be.
And that was not my intention, although I will say for the record that cool air did finally start blowing in here about 20 minutes ago, and I apologize to folks here for their for the hot box treatment. You can tell I wore a sweater this morning when it was 20 degrees, and you see where I'm at right now, and I'm not done yet. Mr. Setzler. Did you have a question? I see a light. Mr. Ramsey, I'm sorry.
4 till 4, so I'm going to waive. I was
No,
going to make
we're not going to cut it off. I mean, don't want to just artificially cut it off. I would encourage you to move forward on it.
The first part of my comments you already summed up, and it's my disdain for the slippery slope argument. I think it's beneath us as a legislative body to suggest that we're not responsible enough to take issues as they come to us in the future, and the fact that we take one step here is going to logically or naturally lead to future steps. I've been here 8 years, and I've probably told 1,000 people that when they've come to my office or in a public hearing to make that. I think it's beneath us as a legislative body and as legislators, and I guess my question is, with this bill, not with some suggestion of what may happen in the future, Frank or Terry, what's the societal ill or the public safety issue that you think may result from this oil being made available to a limited number of folks, children or adult, in the state? What's the public safety implication that rises to the level of our law enforcement community coming out and raising an issue?
Sure. I'm very concerned about the driving under the influence.
Let me ask you to pull the mic a little bit closer to you, Frank, if you could. Thank you.
I am concerned about the driving under the influence issue with the medical marijuana or any type of marijuana. It is difficult to detect, and somebody driving under the influence, as you know, could certainly get into fatal automobile accidents, so we could have an adverse effect that way.
Is there any evidence in any state where this oil's been made available where somebody, there's been a issue that's arisen from somebody that's using this particular delivery mechanism for cannabis, the cannabis oil, where something like that's happened, or is that kind of just the?
I think it's more of fear, sir.
Okay.
Okay, I don't have any facts to
So we don't know if
support
that's
that.
ever actually happened anywhere in the country.
No, but we know that marijuana involved accidents have happened. And
Right, but do we know if cannabis oil accidents have happened?
No, but I first I heard of the 1-to-1 ratio was the other day when I spoke with Representative Peake. You know, I'd like to believe that there's science associated with that, which would negate, you know, the possibility of a psychosis or an impairment of their ability to drive.
Yeah, I have a great deal of respect for both of you, and I've been on this committee 8 years, and I've worked with y'all on hundreds of issues, and it's not just this issue. I'm kind of fed up with the straw man arguments, and I want to deal in facts, and we've got evidence that's out there, and I want to. If that's an issue, folks that are using that oil, and there's accidents that are happening, people are driving, and it's causing people to reach a level of impairment where accidents are occurring, and we've got a public safety situation. I know Representative Peake would be concerned about that. We'd be concerned about that, and we'd like to hear about it. So I guess I'll leave it at this. Let's deal in we've got evidence, we've got a track record in other states. We're not going down an uncharted road here. So to the extent that y'all can provide real evidence, real anecdotes to help us, because that's what we're asking. We're asking for help here. We're making a decision on an important piece of legislation. I would appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from y'all and working with y'all.
Mr. Pack.
Are there any set of conditions or restrictions that you guys would approve adult use of oil for, seizure disorders or any other conditions or indications? Or are your point is anything adult?
Well,
no.
No, I didn't make my point clear. Our sort of revised position on oil is oil for anyone with seizure disorders, period. Our problem were totally related to the expanded number of conditions in which the oil could be used.
So let me ask you, why draw the line there? If the oil helps someone who's suffering from chronic pain, a condition that's diagnosable by a doctor, and doctors prescribe, medicine off-label, regardless of what the FDA says. I know the evidentiary issue in terms of the FDA, that's another set of issues that we talk about, but why draw the line just to seizures? If there's anecdotal evidence that we as a legislative body finds is sufficient to allow it, what will be the argument that the sheriffs and the police chiefs take as to why we should ban it?
Well, from our perspective, when we spoke only of children last year, we were talking of almost a finite number of people that were going to have access, legal access to the oil. And coupled with the more important point was we saw and heard from these families, and these families live in our communities, and their sheriffs came to the Sheriff's Association, and frankly, we have a history of taking care of children through the Georgia Sheriff's Youth Home. So that's the reason they conceded a little last year. But now, with the expansion of these conditions, you're expanding the number of people with access to the oil beyond a number we can estimate. And it's our thought, it's the sheriff's thought, that first group, that smaller group, was legitimate in the sense that if there were problems, we would be able to identify them. I'm not sure with the number of folks we're talking about, and I'm not trying to be fearful here, but we absolutely, our side of the world lives in fear a little bit about what's coming next. And I understand what you all have said about the slippery slope. We understand that. We get that. We shouldn't always act because we're afraid of something. But we are the guys that see the people on the other side. We're not talking about the people that use the oil legitimately, but we're wondering what is it on the other side that we're going to see from this element that is not the element that wants to comply with the law.
Mr. Norris, last year's bill had nothing related to getting permits from the Department of Public Health.
I'm not speaking of that, sir. I'm talking about...
No, I'm saying, but when you said it was okay, you had no restriction, and they have no idea who could have it.
But you had one disorder, the seizure disorder.
Okay, we'll stick with one disorder then. Adult seizures then. What number are you comfortable with, and what number are you not comfortable with?
In terms of number of...
That the Sheriff's Association would be willing to accept. If there's less than 1,000 or 10,000? No, I'm talking about people suffering from seizures only. I'm trying to understand where the line is so we could build a protection around that to satisfy your concerns.
Maybe I misstated, or what I was trying to say is when you limited it to children with seizure disorders, there was a finite number of people, and I don't remember the number of families in the state that was estimated that would use the oil. So we knew there was only a few people. So if there were problems, not only were the children at the heart of the issue, but if there were problems, we would be able to see through these few people. But how many people are there? We don't know. But again, that you asked the question, that's the only answer I can give you. We are concerned about the folks that are not complying with the law and are going to seek out ways to abuse this whole law, period. So,
would you support a framework if, for example, the Department of Public Health has indicated that these indications can be treated with CDB oil? That's notwithstanding the number of people who may suffer from it. Would you support a framework like that?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question except to guess probably not. They conceded a position to agree to the children last year, and that was quite frankly difficult for them. They believe they did it for the right reasons, and so my answer right now would be no.
Okay.
Mr. Gravely. And it's, I just want, I guess, a statement for the record. And Terry and Frank, thank you very much. Y'all know how much I appreciate your work. But I've heard several times, and this isn't really directed at you guys, but just I think for everyone, the expansion of the list. You know, we've added a few things, and the genesis of this was seizure disorders. But I think it should be noted, Mr. Chairman, that really the genesis of this was Representative Verl Smith in 1980, when this body actually passed a medical marijuana bill for research purposes dealing with cancer and glaucoma. Now, whether or not the merits of that bill or how long it lasted, and in 1982 it was over and the board wasn't reappointed. But seizure disorders wasn't discussed in 1980. And it's been said throughout this entire hearing that, you know, technology and research has developed. Well, that was 35 years ago. And so now we've learned more. And we've realized more with medical advances and technology and research that this narrowly defined list of people, be it children, adults, in a limited capacity. And quite frankly, this bill's more limited than the 1980 bill. The 1980 bill was smoking. And this is an oil bill. I think it just needs to be stated that when we're referring to the genesis of where this started, that it was originally the top 2 diagnoses, cancer and glaucoma, was the reason for this. Mona and Harris Taft, I think it was the patient who actually stated that after all the chemo he had received, the only medicine that didn't have any of the dangerous side effects outside of the chemo he was receiving was the marijuana. So if we're talking about the genesis of it, I just wanted to state the genesis of it was 1980 when this body actually did pass that bill.
I appreciate the point. I see no further questions. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. We appreciate your taking the time and the energy to weigh in on it. Look forward to working with you both as well, regardless of any current disagreement. Members of the committee, we I think what we've achieved, what have we achieved here? I think what we have achieved is I think we framed the issues. I think we've learned what the issues are in the bill that are that have to be determined. I don't see a need to go ahead and have a hearing tomorrow, which is our regular committee day, because I think we've pretty much outlined it, and proponents and opponents have laid it out, I think, pretty well. And so now it'll fall to us to do a little more research. I think we do well to maybe gather a little more empirical data that we don't have at our fingertips right now, and maybe consult with some of the professional resources that we have at our disposal to make some determinations, or to be able to make some determinations as it relates to some of the elements of this bill. And with that, I appreciate your time and your patience. And yes, sir. Certainly. We'll allow the author to come. I assume this is what we call rebuttal. Okay.
Or an attempt at it. How about that? And I may defer to Mr. Stanley, but real quick. Let me. I've got a whole laundry list, and I'm gonna get some information to you. But I want to hit.
We'll limit it to you, Mr. Peake, if that's all right. And just.
One, let me just be real clear. I want to partner with law enforcement. It only makes sense to make sure we work together to find out a solution to the differences we have. CBD, a couple of things that kept coming up. CBD counter effect to THC. I didn't pick that out of the air. I mean, I may just look stupid, but I'm not stupid. National Center for Biotechnology Information. We'll get this information. Recent studies examining the protective effects of CBD have shown that CBD can counteract the negative effects of THC. CBD seems to offer natural protection against the marijuana high. There's clear evidence of that. So while they may have studies that show that it doesn't have effect, I'm telling you, I got studies that show it does. And so we got effect. Let me talk about traffic statistics. Somebody asked about that. Since marijuana legalization, highway fatalities in Colorado are at a near historic low. This is from August 2014 article. Fewer traffic accidents in Colorado. Report shows fewer traffic fatalities after states pass medical pot laws. This is from the Denver Post from November. Let's see, November of 2014. So again, I can get this information to you, and I will. But I mean, the direct information that was provided by testimony here today, we have direct opposite information than what's provided, and I can provide that to the committee. The question that came up about the hash oil does not can I have Jesse take 1 minute? Can you do it from right there and just explain that?
Hash oil, the compounds in it, it can't combine with water. It doesn't combine. It's like water and vinegar, and oil. So it can only be combined with something that has fat in it, butter, coconut oil, olive oil, things like that. And to alleviate the olive oil from the ash to build up this big amount of ash would cost more money than I know of anybody who'd be willing to do that. So it's virtually impossible to boil down those things to be left with ash oil.
I mean, you basically can't burn off the butter or coconut oil. I mean, you can't. So it's I don't think it's a valid argument that potentially could lead to abuse. So, two more points real quick. I know it's late. Let me just keep the big picture on this thing. Keep in mind that this is such a limited bill that someone with a medical condition to obtain cannabis oil is going to have to go break federal law, go to another state, take the effort, disrupt their lives, come back to Georgia, and then have protection to even have access. We're not talking about a bunch of abusers that are going to go attempt to get cannabis oil. And in fact, I just don't think it's a valid argument that there's potential for significant abuse for folks with medical conditions that could potentially benefit from cannabis oil. And secondly, as we look at this list of medical conditions, to whether to include it or not include it, I think Representative Gravely said it just right. These are not just letters on the page. If we scratch out cancer as a condition, we scratch out David Garrison. If we scratch out mitochondrial disease, we scratch out Austin Childers or Jagger Cott. If we scratch out multiple sclerosis, we scratch out Melissa Davenport. And so, as we consider this, as we consider these diagnoses and whether to include them or exclude them, and I'm going to ask you to include every single one of them, just remember that these are real lives that we're talking about, real individuals that could potentially benefit and have their lives changed by access to this cannabis oil. Mr. Chairman, thank you, members of the committee. I appreciate very much your indulgence.
Let me just say what the committee understands a couple things. They understand more than a couple, but at least we'll begin with a couple. The first is that with any system, there is bound to be abuse at some point, in some way, that regardless of all the due diligence that we do here, is going to occur. A lot of us have worked in law enforcement in previous lives when we were younger, and we're not naive to that. But we also weigh that against the moral imperative of what we're talking about on a global scale, on a macro scale. My sense is that imperative outweighs the possibility of abuse, however that may occur down the line. And like with any major reform, and this is a major reform, it's inevitable that we would come back to make revisions on things that we thought of everything, but we didn't. That's okay. The people don't expect us to be perfect. They know much better than that. But they expect us to try. And that's why we're here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the committee.